Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Blackqueer Religion Speaker Series and turn it over to Katherine McKittrick to offer a word of welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for logging on. Welcome to the Black Studies Speaker Series. Jennifer asked me to provide a few remarks on Black Studies at Queen's and just provide a bit of a context for the series. Black Studies at Queen's is both longstanding and new, and the new part of Black Studies for us is this launching of our minor in Black Studies, a recent cluster hire in Black Studies, but also holding that newness making sure that newness is in dialogue with the ongoing work of Black students, scholars, intellectuals, and activists in Kingston and at Queen's that have been making Queen's livable for decades. The Black Studies Speaker Series is a set of conversations that are meant to enrich Black studies and also expand our conversations outside Queen's, outside Canada, and think through the diasporic dimensions of Black intellectual life, particularly focusing on questions of liberation, abolition, freedom making, and other modes of other modes of getting free and cultural expression and things like that. The other function of the Black Studies Speaker Series is to insist that the university is a porous space to continually breach the kinds of barriers and walls that the university puts up around us, whether it be through racial or sexual identification, whether it be through our disciplinary homes, and the attempt to sort of hive us off into different communities or groupings. And the speaker series is meant to continually call that into question. Professor Jennifer Leath is doing the first iteration of the Black Studies Speakers Series, and we are so grateful. There's a set of panels that are happening, all of them virtually, so that many of you can join us from elsewhere. And the speaker series this year pivots on Black queer religions. So I want to thank Jennifer and her team for putting all of this together and imagining a Black Studies speaker series that is able to express exactly what we wanted from the speaker series itself. It's diasporic, it's breaching barriers, it's thinking through the connections between community and activism, it's queer, it's quare. So thank you, Jennifer, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Katherine. Well, welcome again. And as Queen's University builds its Black Studies program, an important aspect of this work is attending to these complex intersections of Black discourse and praxis. This series participates in that work by taking up two of the most contested sites of Black studies, religion and sexuality. Though the centrality of religion and Black experience has been acknowledged in various ways through Black studies and scholarship on Black religion, this comes with its challenges. Black religion has evolved through the dispersal of people of African descent through the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the migrations that have followed. Yet, experiences of Black religions as cultural phenomena loosed from the dominance of hegemonic empires and colonizing religious institutions, and grounded in our stories of before, now, and our futures is unfinished work. Then two, pathological sexualizations of people of African descent have not only accompanied the rendering of people of African descent as uncivilized, barbarian, without salvific religion, where religion was cast as a central signifier and justification of culture, but have calcified as a perpetual target for the devaluation of people of African descent. Consequently, when Black studies and scholarship on Black religion dare to address Black sexuality, politics of respectability are not only most readily observed, but also promoted as normative praxis for Black people and communities. The queer aspects of Black study, the sexualities, that are part of our past, present, and futures are silenced and cast as contradictions to who we are as religious and or believing people and communities. Thus, religion and sexuality remains as intersecting site, as an intersecting site and as intersecting sites that demand the attention of critical Black studies. Our attention to these intersections of Black queer religiosities can open the imaginative spaces we need to develop alternative futures where race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and age, among others, no longer sound like a litany of battlefields in a war for the dignities of new humanities or new humanisms. So this series, yes, kicks off with Black queer Buddhisms, and it's a great place and space to learn more about Blackness, about queerness, about Buddhisms. And also, through this space, we are asking participants to contemplate the intersections of Blackness, religion, and sexuality. First, through addressing the intersection from the edges and multiplicities of Blackness, religions, and sexualities through Black queer belongings. And second, to think about the best language to address Black religious and queer space. And so from the edges and multiplicities, today we begin with Black queer Buddhisms, contemplating the linguistic concern. Today's panelists will also take up the challenges and possibilities of E. Patrick Johnson's language of quare for this discourse. I share that definition with you. You can see it now on the screen as a point of reference and for your reflection. Defining quare, E. Patrick Johnson wrote in Queer Studies, or almost everything I know about queer studies I learned from my grandmother. Quare, meaning queer, also opposite of straight, odd, or slightly off kilter from African-American vernacular for queer, sometimes homophobic in usage, but always denotes excess and capable of being contained within conventional categories of being, curiously equivalent to the Anglo-Irish and sometimes Black Irish variant of queer. As in Brendan Behan's famous play, The Quare Fellow, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgendered person of color who loves other men or women sexually or non-sexually and appreciates Black culture and community. One who thinks and feels and acts and sometimes acts up, committed to struggle against all forms of oppression, racial, sexual, gender, class, religious, etc. One for whom sexual and gender identities always already intersect with racial subjectivity. Quare is to queer as reading is to throwing shade. So that's enough, more than enough perhaps. But I must finally and most importantly thank several people and co-sponsors for this work. First and foremost to Katherine McKittrick, thank you so much for the opportunity to share and to lead in this way. To Daniel McNeil, Milka Njororje, Taylor Snack, Taiwa Brima, Danita Anders, Scott Fitzpatrick, Claire Grady-Smith, as well as the Religious Coalition of Reproductive Choice, and the Black Studies Collective, the Department of Gender Studies, the School of Religion, Cultural Studies at Queen's University. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And so first we have Lama Owens, who is an author, activist, and authorized Lama, Buddhist teacher in Kaigyu School of Tibetan Buddhism. He is the co-founder of Bumas Parsha, a Buddhist tantric practice and study community. Lama Rod is the author of Love and Rage, The Path of Liberation Through Anger. Next we have Shante Paradigm Smalls, who is an associate professor and founding co-director of the LGBTQ+ Center at St. John's University. They study Buddha Dharma with Lama Rod Owens and Justin von Budos. They invite you to check out their new publication, where their guest editor, Between Amitabha and Tubman, Black Buddhist Thought, in the Arrow, a journal. And that's the fall 22 edition. We also have Pamela A.O. Yetunde, who has written books and articles on being womanist and being Black and Buddhist. Her next book, Casting Indra's Net, Fostering Spiritual Kinship and Community, will be published in February. A.O. is the principal founder of Buddhist Justice Reporter. Also, allow me to welcome the moderator of today's conversation, Aishah Shahidah Simmons. Aishah Shahidah Simmons is a survivor, cultural worker, and 20-year Theravadan Buddhist practitioner. She is the producer, director of the 2006 released Ford Foundation funded film, No, the Rape Documentary, and the editor of the 2020 Lambda Literary Award-winning anthology, Love with Accountability. Love with Accountability. She's on social media as well, and our panelists' handles will be shared. Aishah it is also my dear sister, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce each of these, our panelists and moderator, and to invite Aishah Shahidah Simmons down to welcome us and to continue in framing our conversation together.
Thank you, Jennifer, my dear, dear sister friend who I've known for a long time, though the person I've known the longest in this thread is Shante, but nevertheless, it's just really wonderful. And thank you for the invitation to be a moderator and be in conversation with my dear, dear beloved Dharma kin. So it's hard to believe that we're here because Jen started thinking, or at least reached out to us in April, which feels like another time period. And I'm really excited that this panel, the Blackqueer Buddhisms panel, is the inaugural conversation in the series of panels envisioned and curated by Jennifer. So what's going to happen is, let me just provide some background, is that Jennifer invited each of the panelists to write a 500-word response to a prompt, which I will share. And then I was asked to write a response to their responses. And true to form, I, of course, initially wrote my response to the prompt. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to write a response to their response. So I do have a response to their response. So I will share the prompt just so all of you in the audience will know to which they are responding. And then each of the panelists will have 5 minutes to respond. And then I will respond, and then we will engage in conversation with each other and then open it up to all of you. So the prompt created by Jennifer S. Leath is, at the heart of Black religious discourses and praxes are existential questions about the meanings of Blackness as it relates to humanity. These questions often manifest in the development and evaluation of prospects of liberation, healing, justice, and transformations of concepts of race. It is self-evident that such work cannot be done outside of full consideration of ability, class, geography, gender, and sexuality. Blackqueer to quare invites scholars and practitioners, authors and activists, creators and artists, community elders, and younger scholars to take up the fundamental existential questions of Black humanities and Black religion, with special attention to quare, i.e. Blackqueer, womanist-oriented subjects. So womanist is to feminist as quare is to queer. In part 4 of her definition of womanist, Alice Walker wrote in 1983, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. In part 5 of his definition of quare, E. Patrick Johnson wrote in 2001, quare is to queer as reading is to throwing shade. The role of womanism in the evolution of discourses and praxes of within Black religion cannot be overstated. Sexism permeating the ranks of Black religious leaders and the communities they represent, as well as scholars of Black religion, has inhibited the flourishing of feminism as such in Black religious discourses and praxes. Likewise, heterosexism, homophobia, and transphobia, permeating the ranks of Black religious leaders and the communities they represent, as well as scholars of Black religion, has inhibited the flourishing of queer potentials in Black religious discourses and praxis. However, like feminist theoethics, queer theoethics is also structurally comprised in ways that inhibit its flourishing within mainstream Black religious discourses and praxis. In what ways Does quare resonate in your religious discourses and praxes? To what extent is it helpful or unhelpful? Linguistic option and why? So we will begin with our first panelist, Lama Owens, and you will have 5 minutes to answer the question.
Yes, thank you, Sister Aishah, and thank you to Queen's University for this opportunity and this invite. A special thanks to Professor Jennifer Leath, who I am a former student of, and who actually was the first person who introduced me to the study of quare and queerness within the study of Black religions and sexuality years ago. So I'm very grateful to be here. I want to start first just by acknowledging the land that I teach on and live on, the ancestral lands of the Creek, Cherokee, and Muskogee people here on a land that is currently called Atlanta, Georgia. This is also the land in which my enslaved ancestors lived and worked as well. So remembering them and remembering my elders and other ancestors who made it possible for me to be here, to be Black and queer and Buddhist, and, you know, kind of a bit of a mess sometimes, but all of that, I offer gratitude to them as well. And of course, I offer gratitude to Beyonce, who is currently the head of my life. And if we were really serious, she's the head of most of our lives right now at this point in history and culture. So when I begin to really think about what I would offer to the panel in terms of the intersectionality of Blackness and queerness and Buddhism, I started hearing the song by the Waters of Babylon. And the version of the song sang by Sweet Honey and the Rock, you know, by the waters of Babylon, you know, where we sat down, where we were asked to sing our songs, you know, but how do we sing our songs in a strange land? And the energy that arose from this kind of blossoming in my mind was really grief. You know, when I think about living at the intersection of Blackness and queerness, I identify and experience a lot of grief around that, a deep longing for a union, to return from separation, to live and abide and to be held warmly and kindly and gently within this intersection of Blackness and queerness. And as I thought about what it is meant to live at this intersection of grief within Buddhist communities here in this country, in the United States, particularly both convert Buddhist communities and heritage, Asian heritage Buddhist communities, I've thought about the ways in which this grief has pointed to, you know, what feels like a very systematic way of being erased. And this lack of being acknowledged, that I come from a particular cultural and historical framework that hasn't been held kindly and tended to within these communities that I came up in as a practitioner and trained in as a teacher. And that really resulted in a kind of resentfulness. You know, I began to resent the ways in which I was being asked to forget myself in order to enter into a path which on the surface has been taught as this passive path of liberation, but has felt more like a path of deeper incarceration and shame and judgment. So when I thought about what it has meant to be or practice authenticity within these communities, you know, I began to understand that how can I sing my song of authenticity, living within this intersection? You know, how can I be my most authentic self in such a strange land that doesn't actually do the work of holding me and acknowledging who I am, right? So queerness, again, coming back to queerness after, a couple of years of being away from it, coming back to queerness, it becomes more and more important for me to be a part of creating spaces that actually naturally embrace who and what I am, the intersections that I live at, right? The intersections of Blackness and queerness, right? To emerge within this dynamic and transformative and generative space of queerness, and how these spaces actually have to be created, outside of traditional Buddhist communities, right? Over these past couple of years, I have kind of transitioned from being a reformist, right, as who was trying to transform traditional Dharma or Buddhist communities, and transition into someone who's about innovating, like creating new communities where we don't actually have to move through this violence of trying to figure out how to be Black and queer within these spaces, but how Black and queerness is just a natural expression, how everyone's intersectionality is a natural expression and held kindly within these communities, and where these natural expressions are able to be seen fully, and where people are able to get the support they need to move from places of grief and shame that they've experienced in these spaces, in other spaces, and how to transition from grief and shame into a place of rejoicing, right? How do we, essentially move from a place of singing our songs naturally, this sits directly within the project of Dharma, because Dharma and Buddhism is about actually getting free, but getting free by actually first acknowledging our relative identities, right? And moving from relative identities into this acknowledgement that our identities are actually these profound gateways into this experience of our ultimate selves, right? And that we can't bypass. We can't bypass the intersections of relative identity thinking that we're going to get to who we are. We have to go through the gate of who we are in this moment and how we're showing up, right? So I will end my comments and sharing here. And thank you so much for sharing this space and holding space with me.
Thank you, Lama Rod. And so our next respondent is Professor Shante Paradigm Smalls.
Hello, everyone. Greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I want to first just send incredible thank yous to Jennifer and Katherine and Black Studies and Queen's University for opening up this, inaugurating this blessed space, this blessed union of Black, queer, and religiosity or religious practices. I'm really looking forward to the other panels, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be with one of my teachers, Lama Rod, one of my students, Aishah, and one of my friends, Yetunde. It's such a blessing. Currently located on Lenape-Hoking territory. I live in Muncie Lenape territory, and I'm currently in Queens, New York. I live in Brooklyn. This question, I'm not going to go into the long answer or the answer I gave in the writing, because I want to reflect more broadly on these keywords of Black, queer, and Buddhism. And particularly what came up for me and what I wrote about in a way was really lineage and the lineage of liberation. And I was thinking really about particularly the queer Black performers, men and women who were really influenced by the Combahee River Collective of the 1970s and 80s, and that vision of liberation for Black folks on marked without marked and intersectional and without preference, but that Black liberation, and particularly liberation of Black women, Black females, Black femmes, was really key to this whole project. And then, going further back and thinking about where they got their name from the actual Combahee River and from the Combahee River raid in 1863, and really one of my touchstone ancestors and practice guides, who is Harriet Tubman. And I think for me, particularly in the last 5 or so years, definitely when I started studying with Lama Rod and Lama Justin on Buddhisms, but even before then, I began to think about the limits that organized Buddhism. I was a member of an organization that went through a very serious Me Too moment, and and ended up separating from the guru, and he's doing his own thing, and the organization is doing their own thing, and I was offered an opportunity, what felt like an ejection, but really was an incredible opportunity to really pursue lineages of liberation that weren't bound to certain kinds of, particularly in the tantric tradition, the ways that white supremacy and the Tibetan system in particular really feed into each other in terms of racial supremacy, even though they say they're above that. And so, I started writing a sadhana, or a practice, a contemplation practice, a deity practice related to Harriet Tubman, and that this special issue that I had the pleasure to guest edit between Amitabha and Buddha and Tubman, Harriet Tubman, thinking about Black Buddhist thought, Black Buddhist theory as being held in all of these spaces that include the diaspora of the African continent. So I'm really excited in a lot of ways, even though I was talking to one of my teachers yesterday, and I said, I feel a little bit like a Ronin, a samurai without a real without people, and in some ways that feels there's a kind of like disorientation, and another way there's just joy, there's just play. In the tantric tradition, we talk about the playful playing with ayatanas, playing with experience instead of being so rigid. The form is always free. So I think, no longer being in a situation where Black and queer are dirty words in relationship to Buddhism has enabled my practice to be, my 5 minutes, to be more authentic. And, so that when I make the ultimate transition from this existence to the next existence, I can actually do that with less clutter. So I'm really grateful, and thank you.
Thank you, Shante. Our next respondent will be Ayo, Professor Ayo, writer Ayo Yetunde.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Well, I don't know if you can. If you can, I'll put on my...
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. I could go on for my 5 minutes and just express gratitude, but I won't do that, except to say that it's really important to me to say that those of you who have agreed to be on this call, in this presentation, listening, I really want to express my gratitude to you as well, because it's not every day that we experience, I'm going to put on my timer, that we experience a lot of people wanting to listen to things that Black people say, that queer people say, that Buddhists say. And when you put the combinations together, a lot of people would have a lot of reasons not to be here. So thank you for being here. I want to express my thoughts from the perspective of someone who is a spiritual or pastoral caregiver, a pastoral counselor, a professor of pastoral theology, and say that when I did my dissertation research in 2015, 2016, which was published in 2018, I focused on the lives of African American, using the word lesbian or using the phrase same-sex loving women, African American lesbians, queer women, same gender loving women who were practicing Buddhism in the Insight tradition. And one of the things that I learned from the practices is that these women express themselves as having, not using these words, these are my words, but as having relational resilience. Relational resilience in the context of a political, cultural environment that, as we have seen and will see again, can be very easily turned against us. To say that our lives don't matter, our well-being doesn't matter, our health doesn't matter, our rights don't matter. And that despite all of these various ways of being discriminated against, of enacting oppression against us, that through these Buddhist practices, there is still a resilience. And by that, I mean an ability to cultivate loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, sympathetic joy towards others. And I find that remarkable. So I called it remarkable relational resilience, because we could very well choose to not be that and could actually identify ways to justify it. So this thing about quare and queer, I'm not a linguist. I had never heard the word before I got invited to be on this panel. I had never heard it spoken until I heard Katherine say the word. So with that, I want to say that my presentation is not one of an expert on linguistics or the use of this word, but one who is wondering about how do we use these words and these concepts to care for ourselves and care for each other better. What I like about the word quare is that it gives justification / permission for Buddhists who are practicing kindness, sweetness, compassion, to be fierce and to be fiercely critical of the systems that are geared towards oppressing us. There's another side to the word that I'm not quite sure about yet, because I haven't contemplated it long enough and haven't lived into it, which is how useful is it if most people aren't using it? You know, does it invite conversation? Does it confuse conversation? Does it burden conversation? And or does it create an opening for conversations that need to be had, that must be had? So in this context that we are in right now, this political, cultural context that we are in, where frankly, our lives will be used as a litmus test as to whether you are liberal or conservative, progressive, good, bad, and so on. Our lives will be on the line again, as they were at the beginning of the Trump administration, when they singled out transgender people to reverse all of the gains that they had made. Our lives will be on the line again. And the words that we use, queer, quare, and other words, will be of vital importance. The most important thing, I think, is that we skillfully use the words that people understand for our ultimate well-being. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayo. All right, so I prepared a written response to the what everyone responded. So wait, before I go into my response, I want to say that after we have I share my response, and the panelists and I have a chance to engage. We are opening it up to the Sangha, to the community, the virtual community, to ask Q&A. And we ask that you please put your Q&As in the Q&A section of the webinar, which it should be at the bottom of your screen. If your screen is truncated, it would be where it says more and in 3 dots, and you can click on it, or you can see it in its entirety. So just wanted to share that. So in reading the responses of my dear Blackqueer, Dharmakin, Lama Rod, Shante, and Io, and factoring my own threads, I observe curiosity, openness, and embrace. What is undeniable is a quest for, in search of more expansive interpretations of freedom and liberation. Buddhism is one, not necessarily the one, only one, that appears to resonate with all of our current journeys called life. All of our journeys, called life. And again, this is in response to the written responses, what I'm about to share. So I was struck with Io holding the compassionate space with right or ethical speech. That is to say, in response to the kind of reading and throwing shade, like, what, is that really Buddhist ethical speech? And she articulated that it is not extracted out of its fuller coinage, and it seems to invite harsh critical speech that can result in harming another. Simultaneously, however, she also acknowledges that she brings her 40 years of lived experiences before practicing Buddhism to her analysis, and invokes the Black feminist, lesbian, mother warrior poet Audre Lorde when she wrote, she being Io, critical speech that was deserved was and is considered speech in the service of self-preservation in an anti-Black culture. Io identifies as a Buddhist who, like Audre Lorde, believes self-preservation in this culture is a political act. And she spoke to that just a few moments ago. In response to many Black Buddhists expressing indignation from their experiences of being in white or predominantly white Buddhist communities, Io interrogates the response going forward. And she sees a quote, in quote, theo, Buddho ethically appropriate to speak from the emotions that arise from indignity. And as we do so, make an attempt to be aware of what we are feeling, express it with right intention to be authentic, holding open the possibility of repair while also stating boundaries. As long as we can quare without the intention of humiliating others, she writes, she believes the power of our emotional response to indignities can have a transformative effect in our Buddhist communities and elsewhere. Shante posits that quare never really resonated with them as a hermeneutic or practice. As a queer Black feminist scholar, Shante believes that E. Patrick Johnson's theoretical intervention is part of their vocabulary, but not part of their imagined or embodied practice. And as Shante also shared earlier today, that they amplified the Combahee River Collective statement as sacred texts. And those are my words, but I wouldn't be surprised if they are Shante's words as well, that deserves continuous reading and studying. For those who don't know, the Combahee River Collective was a group of radical Black feminists who wrote this profound statement in the early 70s. Shante points to the Combahee River and the Combahee River Raid that happened June 1st to the 2nd, 1863, where ancestor and Bodhisattva Harriet Tubman led an incursion which resulted in emancipation of over 750 enslaved Black people. Harriet Tubman is a major part of Shante's meditation practice, visualizations, chants, deity, worship, and much more. And Mother Tubman parent ancestor Tubman sits on Shante's altars in various locations. They share that they call Tubman to mind when they feel in distress or feel they can't go on. Their training as a Vajrayana Buddhist has empowered them to incorporate those beings who strengthen them. Nothing is wasted, Shante says. So it is in this context that Shante suggests that their spiritual work with Tubman may be a quare practice rather than a queer one. What Shante is explicitly clear that it is definitely a Black one inside of Buddhism. Citing the reggae song in both in his writing and as well as just earlier in his presentation, By the Rivers of Babylon, whose words come from the Psalm 137 in the Bible, and performed by many groups, but Lama Rod points to the Grammy Award-winning a cappella group Sweet Honey in the Rocks rendition, that he shares that he came to Buddhism because he was longing to return to Zion, to return to his most authentic and liberating expression within a culture that seemed intently concerned with keeping him from freedom. Quare is useful for Lama Rod as a lens for him to understand how Buddhism is a path and project for all of us to express our most liberated self. And this liberated self as an experience is imperative as a map by and through which Blackness and queerness point to the experience of liberation. Lama Rod believes that queering of Buddhism, so to speak, is the first acknowledgement that there are Black queer folks practicing Buddhism, and that it is a unique, identity location that we occupy. He points to the policing and erasure that is experienced by Black queer folks who practice in both heritage and covert Buddhist traditions, where anti-Blackness and anti-queerness is transmitted under the guide of spiritual practice. And so, as he pointed out earlier, in response to this violence, he committed to training to be a teacher and scholar, to create communities to disrupt the harm. So personally, at the time in 2002, Black feminism was my gateway to Buddhism. The writings of Audre Lorde and Toni Cade Bambara provided undeniable relationality to Buddhist teachings, and they were not Buddhist. Tragically, however, I learned to bypass my identities at the apparent level, Black, woman, lesbian, to access pure Dhamma taught in the lineage I practiced for 17 years. I compartmentalized myself precisely because I found unwavering solace and rigor through Vipassana meditation. It wasn't until years later, 3 years ago, so, we're 2019, which was 17 years after, that I really understood that white supremacy, Brahmin supremacy, patriarchy, and heterosexist beliefs influenced these teachings. Enter the era of my studying with Black teachers, including Terere Sala, Shante Smalls, and Dara Williams. So I greatly appreciate E. Patrick Johnson's creation and definition of quare, and without any judgment and definitely no shade, only right speech here, Io. I don't feel a need to incorporate quare for my religious discourses and praxes. I believe my embodiment of these identities, Black, woman, lesbian, Black, feminist, lesbian, interrogates and challenges white supremacy, patriarchy, misogyny, homophobia, and heterosexism inside and outside of religious discourses. My cultural, religious, spiritual, and political praxis are informed through these ever-shifting identities. And perhaps my leaving my former lineage to move into new interpretations of Dhamma, including openly acknowledging and practicing with the apparent and ultimate realities as we all embody, is a form of queer, of moving in a queer space. I don't know. What I do know is that language is potent. I believe we, especially Black people living in the Americas and Caribbean, factoring the unspeakable horrors and ongoing legacy of the Middle Passage, must have the right to name ourselves and our beliefs. I am interested in and committed to freedom from all without causing harm, and I'm not alone. Lama Rod, Professor Io, and Professor Shante have all shared versions of this, and I'm unequivocal in my belief that true liberation comes from within. So like Io, Shante, and Lama Rod, I believe it's essential to be open to new words and terms and definitions created and used to support humancipation. So rather than eman, like humancipation, whether we use them personally or not. And so what I want to do now is open and invite Shante and Io and Rod to turn on their screens, and I want to ask each of you questions and for us to have a dialogue before we open it up to the community Sangha. And so since I will not go in the same order that we started, I will, shake it up some and begin with you, Shante, and just ask if you'd be willing to expand more on your inquiry around how your spiritual work with Tubman may be a quare practice rather than a queer one. Just curious, particularly in terms of how you opened your statement around saying it's a term that you respect and honor, but it's not one that you necessarily embody. And so in the closing of your statement, you kind of pose this kind of, exploration of if this is a queer practice or instead of a queer one, definitely Black inside of Buddhism.
Thank you so much, Aishah, for your words and for moderating. And I'm still so filled up. I'm like, what thoughts are in my head? I think in particular, I'm thinking about two things. One, I'm thinking about the violence of my vocation, which is a professor, and I'm thinking about the violence of my avocation, which is as a Dharma teacher. And I've been on a break this year mostly from teaching Dharma, and hopefully next year also will be on break from teaching Dharma. And part of it has to do with something that Zenju Earthman Manual had presented as a kind of provocation, which is what do Black Buddhist spaces look like without the kind of I don't know if she would use the word dependent, but without the kind of reliance on white audiences, for many people that that's the livelihood, right? And what could be opened up when this kind of patronage model isn't holding Black people back. But in terms of the queer and queer one, I think in part because I'm really thinking about the love that Harriet Tubman had for us, had for her people, so much so that she would shoot someone who dared go back to enslavement. I mean, that's like a deep commitment to love and liberation. It's like, I'm going to free you. It's a very, very tantric too, right? It's like you cut the aorta of the, and you lead that person to freedom. You don't leave them bleeding. You help them to freedom. So it's deep love and deep sacrifice, as you said, deep bodhisattva, deep awakened being work. And so at the heart of that I think that's more at the heart of prayer. Whereas queer, and I don't know if I said this, I think my experience in Black communities is, they call us the most homophobic and all this nonsense, but there's really there's not so much separation between Black and queer. It's like Black queers and Black trans people are embedded in Black community. I'm a double PK. Both my parents were Pentecostal ministers. My grandfather was a bishop. My grandmother was a reverend. I come from a long line of religious Christians, and there were queer folks there, contested and as it may be. So I think that at the heart of queer is Blackness, and that and love for Blackness and unapologetic. And I think that I spent a lot of my life, even before I came to Buddhism as a teenager, but even apologizing or trying to, as Rob said, assimilate or reform. And now it's like radical love, learning that and relearning that. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. I really was struck. When you're in with your just analysis or insight around right speech and yeah, it just really hit me and moved me. So not just, and so I'm wondering, and I know you already shared that this is your first introduction to queer. So I mean, if you're like, whoa, I can't even go there, then please speak, let me know. But I'm wondering, in terms of, it feels like to me, because I know the term, but I'm not well versed. It's not something like that I've heard for a long time or even used. But it seems to me that queer is in response to various forms of humiliation and marginalizations. And so I'm wondering, in response, and thinking about your response, what are possible ways that queer could be used without harming others? You shared in your response about how can our compassion at response to indignities have a transformative effect in our communities and elsewhere? And so, and you also was like, as long as we can queer without the intention of harming others, I believe the power of our emotional response to indignities can have a transformative effect in our Buddhist communities and elsewhere. So just wondering, right, like if this is in, sometimes, hurt people, like in that, we know this in so many ways. And so what are ways that you can imagine, maybe even about how we can use, if we use this term, in response, right, to humiliation without humiliating or harming others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I will try not to speak from the position of an expert. Okay. But I think sometimes about the intensity around the emotion, around the coinage of terms, right? So scholars, that's what we do, right? Scholars, we coin terms. I've coined terms myself. And so this term, I think the several part definition ends with sort of like an intense feeling, right? And if we know anything about calling people out, right? There are different ways you can call people out, right? It is part of our tradition. By tradition, I mean Black folks. In order to survive, to be seen and heard, we need to call people out. That is a necessity. We have to do it. Now, we're Buddhist practitioners, so there's an art in living that we study. So what are the artful ways that we can call people out without diminishing who we are? Right? So we don't call people out, or let's put it this way. I don't know if we can, let me put it this way. I do not believe we should hold in one hand, the posture towards being apologetic for who we are. You can dump that, just turn that upside down, dump that. On the other hand, I believe we should pay close attention to what needs to be said in order to bring about the best possible outcome. We can't control the outcome, but through our practices in mindfulness, our ethical obligations towards non-harm, even though we do harm still, maybe that can open up the possibility of responses. And so as we call people out, we don't push them out. Can we call people out and then keep them in at the same time? It's like, I have a client who said, I drink 3 glasses of wine per night just to go to sleep. After the first time they admitted, I just listened. The second time they said something about it, I said, you drink too much. And I could see how in their body, because we're online, in their body, they began to leave me, so to speak. And I said, hold up. You drink too much and I'm here for you. You drink too much and I have your back. And I want to help you get to a place where you don't need as much in order to have a good night's sleep. That may not be the best example, but maybe you can get what I'm talking about. We need to tell the truth and also not run away once we've told it. We need to tell the truth and also still be invitational for someone to stay in that place and consider what we've said and see if there's still a possibility for us to maybe take our relationship to a different level.
Thank you. Yeah, I think about the calling in, as Loretta Ross calls calling in, but which is what you're saying, you're calling out, but then yet bringing in, not pushing out. And thank you. Lama Rod, I'm interested in just what you, if you could expound upon when you wrote about Buddhism in convert communities will never evolve until it takes root in traditionally marginalized communities who embody a dharma that is rooted explicitly in justice as well as in ultimate liberation. And you were very clear also that you're not advocating for a separate queer space. So, but if you could just share about that.
Absolutely. I'm just not interested in being in communities that don't know how to struggle. I'm not interested in identifying with groups who have never had to engage in collective collaboration, cooperation, When I talk about convert Buddhist communities, I'm talking about white middle class, cis, communities, right, who have been absent from certain kinds of struggle that my ancestors and my community have been very deep in, and that struggle has yielded a kind of resilience, but a kind of clarity about what it actually means to be free, and that freedom is for everyone, not just for a certain group of people. So when I think about the struggles of my communities, of Black communities, of queer communities, of Black queer communities in general, like we're trying to get everyone free, not people who just look like us, not people who are in the same income bracket, not people who are meek and mild, who fit the kind of performance of, the stereotype of a Buddhist. We're trying to get everyone free, the meek and mild, the messy, and the pains in the asses. Everyone needs to get free. And so when I've come up in convert Buddhist communities, I've been labeled the problem because I've been so interested in justice, and I'm one of the few male cisgender Dharma teachers who are actively calling out teacher-student abuse and ethical misconduct, right? And when you, as Sarah Ahmed has pointed out, when you point the problem out, you become the problem. I'm tired of being the problem because I believe in liberation, a liberatory Dharma that actually has to invite everything into the light to be interrogated and for harm to be reduced. So I'm tired of doing that labor for convert communities. So I reinvested my energy in creating communities where we're starting with justice, not as this side project that we invite Black and queer Dharma teachers in to talk about, so you feel good. I'm talking about starting with the liberatory energy and essence of Dharma to begin with. And everyone isn't ready for that, and that's fine, So.
Thank you. So I want to give us, before I open up the floor, there are already 2 questions about Beyonce. So you've touched on something, Lama Rod, but before I go there, I would like to give you all a chance for us to engage with each other. So if there are questions that you want to ask each other in this moment, just to open it up so that we can be in dialogue before opening it up wider.
Well, I just want to say just quickly to Io how much I appreciate your critique of queer, because, we love to coin, as you said, we love to coin our terminology, but sometimes it's just too much. Sometimes it's like our intellectualizing of the work creates distance between us and the people who are still in communities. Not to say that we're not, on those front lines in community, but it creates more different and more separation when it's like, okay, we're going to do queerness now. Everyone, I know you just got on board to queerness, but we're going to do queer, and just people are just like, but that it comes out of the ways in which we're so programmed in the academy into like forge ahead and create new rhetorics, right, and new language, and we haven't really done the embodiment of the language we already have, right? And how do we listen to the people who are actually at the front lines, embedded in this work, and what are they saying? What are they using? And we're going to be very surprised. We are very surprised. And again, we're in these spaces, so like I can bring a whole bunch of language, from the homegirls on the street in Atlanta, who are at the forefront of this liberation work, but I'm not going to do that right now.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that is the key, and that's why I'm so glad that people are listening to Black Buddhists right now, is because we are in touch, practicing getting in touch with our bodies. Regardless of the Buddhism that one is practicing, it is a phenomenological experience. In other words, paying attention to what is happening in the body right now. And so words can help and words can obscure. And it's just important to know what words are doing what.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this, about language, particularly from a kind of a leftist perspective, how there's just so much expectation for language to do so much. And then sometimes when people don't get the language right, people are like, oh, I can tell that means you're X, Y, and Z. And actually that person may be the deepest, most, radical person, but they're in a different world. We exist in different worlds. We exist in different realities, different locations. And, I think there's sometimes an impetus to cut people off just when there's a little freaking discomfort, not even real discomfort, because we don't share the same language, let's say, for example. And I think that that's very short-sighted. It might be a function of people's trauma responses. It might be a function of people's laziness. It might be a function of people's comfort levels. And I'm really interested in what when you have a conversation, like I just started. I'm behind, so please don't get on me. I just started watching P-Valley, and I'm like, oh, this is shit. And then I also watch rap shit. And if y'all not watching rap shit, that is it's on HBO. Issa Rae produced it. It's about Miami. You can just imagine, right? Black Miami. And one of the things when I'm watching these kinds of shows, one of the things I realize is like, how far we can get from people's realities, right? How there are so many levels to living and existing that I don't have to experience anymore. But I may have experienced, as a younger person or growing up or earlier in my 20s. And I think sometimes when I'll just speak for myself, when I have certain platforms, we want to say Black folks do this, but it's a variety. And I love learning from Black people in different locations, in different psychic locations, emotional locations, social class locations, geographic locations. I'm learning from, and our conflict, whether it's like something more comical, like the Jollof Wars, who has better Jollof, is it, Nigeria, is it Ghana, or more serious and painful conversations around, let's say some of the conversations that happened around Woman King or around Black Panther, around when our families abandon us, when our families sell us, right? And they didn't know what they were participating in, and the pain that is still present right now. And so when we just think a word or a phrase, someone who's very into language and, has coined phrases, we can't let that be. That's one tool, It would be like as a meditator only meditating, and not helping anyone. You know what I mean? Not meditating for someone who's in poverty and not offering them water, or food. So that trap of who's the most sophisticated, I think sometimes that's a vestige of white supremacy, right? And that's something that I can leave behind, both and that's in Buddhism too. That's in Buddhist circles where, oh, do you know this term? I'm gonna trick, I'm gonna pop quiz, do you know? And it's like, well, what do I treat people? How do I treat people? How do I treat myself? How do I treat my environment? Those are the things I try to ask myself on a daily basis.
Thank you. Unless any of you, like I see, we've got some really thick, deep, multi-layered questions, and I'd like to open it up just to, so that folks, we can hopefully get to all of them. So wait, there's one in the chat. Let me just, and then the that I saw that came before the other ones, and it says, could Lama Rod go into more detail about the place, role, and significance that Beyonce has in his spiritual beliefs and practice?
If you know me, you know you don't have to ask that question. So I'm just going to freely offer that in every response. So I have given multiple Dharma talks about Beyonce over the years, especially about this artifact here. I don't even have a record player. That's how serious it is. Like, I don't know how I'm going to play this, but I have it, you know? And, you know, when I talk about Beyonce, people are like, oh, it's just a joke, it's just a joke. But you have to understand who you have to be to produce a piece of art that helps people breathe for the first time in a very long time. Like, that helps people reduce suffering, you know? And I think that we can downplay the work and the intellectual labor of Black women and Black femmes, as we always do and have historically done. But if we're really interested in freedom, we have to be interested in joy, right? And, you know, artists like, art like this has produced joy, offered joy, transmitted joy. And that's a very high level practice, because there are a lot of people who do really well in transmitting despair, hopelessness, you know, sadness. Joy helps us to do the work, right? And so when I am deep in work and labor of getting free, I turn my mind to work, to people who connect me back to joy. And this is one of my practices. I call it the 7 homecomings practice, where I lead people through a series of remembering people, experiences, communities that actually offer support and care in terms of the work that we're doing to get free. So yeah, you know, I think Beyonce is, you know, extraordinary. We would say, my teacher would say, you know, not ordinary. So Beyonce is someone who is not ordinary. And I think that the path of the Bodhisattva, you know, is quite diverse, you know, and Bodhisattvas or Buddhist saints show up in the ways that people need them, and in ways that they're not expected to show up, but they show up, you know. So that's the place of Beyonce, you know. It's the same place that many, you know, queer Black writers and artists like James Baldwin and Essex Hemphill and Marsha P. Johnson, you know, just to name a few, Andre Leon Talley. Now, I got into a lot of trouble with Andre Leon Talley on social media when I equated Andre Leon Talley to Thich Nhat Hanh, you know, and the white people lost it, you know. And I was like, Andre Leon Talley has actually helped me to be freer than Thich Nhat Hanh did. So Andre Leon Talley is actually my teacher. You know, Thich Nhat Hanh is too, don't get me wrong, but like, it's people showing up who reflect me back to me that helps me to survive, you know. So that's it, that's all I'll say, you know. But, you know, I don't know what kind of spell work Beyonce put into this, but like, she's got us, she got us.
Thank you. I will, I'm gonna do all the 3 questions that I see here, but I wanna, there's a question here, and I believe I mean, anyone can answer it, but it's directed to Io. This is such a gorgeous Sangha. Thank you for curating this space together. To follow with Sister Io's caution about the kinds of discursive violences that hold space for harm as seemingly part of our Black queer culture, I want to know if reading and throwing shade, the dozens, cancel culture, are manifestations of trauma prep, trauma response, and harm celebration, and how can we tell truths about other kinds of self, community harm practices that we can lovingly confront, so that we can confront seemingly benign was that violence lives in all of our language. Phrases like "I was struck by" or "I slay" seem to glorify violence in speech. Or am I being too sensitive to terms?
You know, that question, just contemplating on that question, I don't need to even respond to it, because you can tell, but I will say something, right? But you can tell in the question itself is a world of complexity on what it means to try to be a human being in this life. I'll focus a little bit just on the words we use. Our culture, and I'm going to be specific to the United States, that's the one I know the most, is a violent culture. Oh yes, we do love in this culture. Yeah, and there are manifestations of love, but it is violent. You can hardly be entertained without some form of murder, bloodletting, rape, insult, some type of indignity, erasure. I don't think you're being too sensitive by asking the question and being concerned about the things you're concerned about. And maybe my hope is that by listening to Blackqueer, quare, Buddhists, that the sensitivity that you have and that you're cultivating can be used towards justice making, relational resilience, and telling the truth in a way that recognizes that other people are sensitive too. So I'd say sensitivity is a strength in this regard. And thank you so much for that question. And that's the kind of question I would love to see just posted on social media for people to just contemplate.
I just copied it. That was Lyndon Gill. Thank you, Lyndon, for that question. Did
May I
anyone
just
else
say
want to
something?
respond? Yeah, I was
Yeah,
about
I
to
was
say.
going to say, Lyndon, thank you so much. And I'm sending you love, Lyndon. And I think about this a lot. And I think part of the difficulty is the speed at which things move and which we move. I mean, and particularly social media, you know, and that some of these things, like this very dense, thick, complex, human-oriented, love-oriented question you're asking, it's a contemplation, right? It's something that has to be first read and maybe spoken and then felt, you know? So it's not, you know, sometimes I'll say, I just say this little thing when I'm teaching is like, first listen, first listen, right? And then I'll then think about what you're hearing and then feel it and then respond. And so a question like this is a gift. It feels like a real gift. And I think about just the amount of violence. It's October. I love horror. I love horror. I mean, I'm like, you know, and I think about what my limits are. Like, I'm like, okay, I know I'm not going to watch Jeffrey Dahmer on Netflix because I lived through that as a witness, right, and was traumatized by that. But also, that's not fantasy, you know. And those families are we're still glorifying the murderer, you know, the dead serial murderer. You know, he gets to be, you know, even in the most horrific ways that you can treat another human being, that person is getting, you know. And I say a little prayer for Evan, what's his name, Evans, who's playing, because he's always playing a crazy person. So I'm like, I hope he's okay. You know, but these things that I take in, right, you know, and then the things that I put out. So I think that there is a lot of, we use the word trauma a lot, but it's a real thing. It's embodied, and that the healing has to be also embodied too. And that takes time. I just want to make a recommendation for a book, which is called The Buddha's Wife. And it's a story, it's sort of cultural history, sort of fictional. It's about Yashodhara, right? And it's about her experience after Shakyamuni, before he became Buddha. Shakyamuni leaves her, abandons her and their child, Rahula. And it's about how the community of mostly women, though some men in the castle or the whatever, help her heal. And it's about how contemplation and compassion practices are communal. It is so powerful. And it's a grief and rage as the doorway to communal healing. So it's a very easy read, but it's something that, and it's from this perspective of sort of women in Buddhism, right? Which is, it's communal. It's not the person who goes off and does the 12-year cave retreat. Although, women do that. And it's not the person who like whatever builds the stuff and the teacher knocks it down, but it's these practices of grief and raging and crying and heartbreak in community. And so it's something that I think is a really powerful book.
Thank you. So the next person, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly, and I apologize in advance if I am. It's Matthew Chatelaine. And they said, "Hi there. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the meaning behind certain lyrics in Beyonce's Alien Superstar. We dress a certain way, we walk a certain way, we talk a certain way, we paint a certain way, we make love a certain way, all of these things we do in a different, unique, specific way that is personally ours." So I don't know. So go ahead.
Yes. This kind of goes back also to the last question, because I come out of not just Buddhism, but I come out of shamanic practice and training. I come out of hoodoo, and a lot of ancestral magic in my family. And so much of these systems are about balance, right? I think that we have to, including Tantra, that we have to enter into a relationship with the phenomenal world where we're concerned with balance. And sometimes we have to meet certain energies, with stronger energies in order to bring something back into balance, right? I'm not a non-violent person, I choose violence when I need to bring balance back to a situation. I choose violence when I need to protect myself and others who, can potentially be hurt and victimized. I choose violence not because I want to hurt people, but I choose it because I want people to see that they're out of control and that certain energies can remind them about what's happening in the moment and bring them back to an experience of mindfulness and presentness, right? So, it's, words like, alien superstar, and words like slay, it's, yeah, there's always trauma. Trauma is always on the table, right? But the question is, how aware am I of trauma? Am I reacting to it, or am I actually being consumed by it in a way that I'm reproducing it in culture? That language is also about boundaries, because that's the only way certain people will pay attention, is that, like, if you get close, I'm going to slay you. Slaying, this is the boundary, and to do that out of love. And that's what I advocate. I'm going to set this boundary, but I want you to be safe and happy, but you're not going to be safe and happy if you cross this boundary right now, right? And particularly, to Alien Superstar, it's like, it's reminding us that, like, our individuality and the ways that we express ourselves that are actually deeply informed by the communities that we come up in, it's not something that should be discarded, but it's something that can be embraced, and that there is room for all of us to embrace our uniqueness. And the problem is, so much of who and what we are being erased by dominant cultures, right? And this is what this Black queer discussion is really about. I want to enter into space, and culture fully myself, right? And my expression of uniqueness doesn't mean that you can't be yourself, unless being yourself means that it's creating violence for me. And that's the confusion that we're at. People think being uncomfortable, is an act of violence, when in fact, it may actually signify that you should, actually get more curious about how people are showing up, and understand that it's not about hurting you, but it's about people expressing themselves fully, and knowing that, like, you're just not used to that because you come from a dominant culture, So you're being asked to make space in a way that feels violent for you because you're so self-identified with dominance,
Thank you.
Unique.
And the next question is also, and I mean, it's directed towards you, Lama, but I would also love to hear the other folks' comments, if applicable. Given Lama Rod's comments about identifying and connecting with marginalized people, I'm wondering how the panelists feel about Asian heritage communities who claim ownership of a Buddhist tradition, some of whom might see themselves as victims of racism, who must rescue Buddhism from cultural appropriation. Can Black queer Buddhism offer a path for Asian folks, and especially queer Asian folks, to think about Buddhism in a transformative way? And the question is posed by Sailaja Krishnamurti, and I'll put the question in the chat. So whoever would like to begin with answering. So can Black queer Buddhism offer a path for Asian folks, and especially queer Asian folks, to think about Buddhism in a transformative way?
I mean, I'll just start very briefly because I feel like I talk too much, I think one of the central questions that we don't like to talk about, but we need to talk about, is how immigrant Asian communities take on anti-Blackness to gain proximity to whiteness. And that's where the conversation actually needs to go, right? It's like, yeah, I mean, I think Black, queer, Dharma cultures can actually become a mirror, but you can't respond to that mirroring through acts of violence, which manifests as erasure and critique, and judgment, saying, well, that's not Dharmic, that's not what we do in Buddhism. Then you just kind of erased everything that I'm trying to show you about liberation, So I would just offer that, right now.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar, whereas I think that the first look is like, what are both Asian immigrant and Asian heritage, Buddhist heritage communities' investments in whiteness? Some of this has to do also with celebrity, right? The way that like white people have, they figure out how to be celebrities at whatever, whether it's a Peloton or a yoga or like everything is can be a Buddhist celebrity, right? So some of that has to do with that, and another part has to do with the real, real colonization, right? But when I think about the way that Buddhism came to to North America, particularly to the U.S. and Canada, the first lights were really of those South Asian and East Asian and Southeast Asian great teachers were white folks. Those people, I think about my own lineage, and Trump Rinpoche didn't give a shit about Black people. He wasn't seeking Black people out. They weren't going to those communities. They were going to communities that could support them financially. So the anti-Blackness that is in a lot of the Asian countries and in these Asian Buddhist traditions is something that's not discussed, and we're not seen as valuable, even to the point where we're not even seen as potentially being able to be enlightened, so I think that's one thing. And of course you can use the, you can use whatever tools we have. But I think the real work is like the investment in white supremacy or Buddhist, Asian Buddhist supremacy or anti-Blackness, and also separating from whiteness, right? And that's hard, because many of us have been taught white is right, or we're all one and we're all together, and any concerns you have about your own kind of personal safety, that's based identity is delusional, right? And it's like, well, no, you actually attack people, and these are actually identity-based attacks. And so and I know that there's a lot of time, there also is some, I've heard and talked to people, there's some jealousy at a lot of what people perceive Black teachers getting attention that should be reserved, for Asian teachers. So there's a lot of complex, I think, multi-directional feelings and circumstances, right? We know that karma is like, it's a trillion things arising. And I do think that this idea of the real basis of this country is like anti-Blackness and is anti-indigeneity, and so those things are reproduced on so many levels. I just think about my own experience in my Sangha, which wasn't the first Sangha I belonged to. The first Sangha I belonged to was very diverse, but it was a little, I'm not going to talk about that, but it just wasn't for me, right? And then when I joined, another Sangha, what I noticed, I felt the Dharma felt right. It was immediately drawn to it. It was so powerful. I was like, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be. But, it was like a handful of Black people, a handful of Asian folks, a handful of Latinx folks. And that was like a red flag, but I stayed for over 12 years because the dharmic and karmic connection was so strong and was so powerful, that I ignored some things or I complained or whatever. But, at the end of the day, at the center of it was centering white, wealthy people. And that just became untenable after a time. And I said, okay, what are you going to do to actually pursue liberation?
I feel like it. Oh, go ahead, Ayo. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I'm curious about what you're going to say.
All right. What I was going to say, it feels to me like there's like kind of a both and not either or. Like I do. So in response to the question, I do think that Asian people, queer Asian people that Black queer Buddhism offers can offer a path to queer Asian folks, to Asian folks. I definitely think that. I also and I think the reverse can be true. I think what just echoing what's already been shared is these really critical conversations around anti-Black racism in Buddhism, as practiced and interpreted here in the U.S. And I think that and what I'm finding, and I understand it's important, right? Because we know the first sanghas were Asian sanghas, so I'm experiencing and observing a justifiable and righteous kind of pushback, right, against kind of like what's happening in the West, but the white appropriation of Asian cultures. For me, though, it's kind of fascinating that it's happening at the same time of many kind of like the emergence, if you will, of Black teachers and leaders, of Buddhism. So it's kind of like, wait a minute, hold it, so there's something there to that. Like, I'm not, like I'm all there for the critique about white appropriation and racism and white supremacy. But then somehow I experienced some kind of try not like just something I want to just to get us straight to the point, shade, if you will, towards like Black folks. It's almost like we don't really know the real Dharma. We're not, there's something there. So I think that and I'm really interested in those kind of those conversations, those cross-cultural conversations with Black and Asian communities, recognizing the diaspora, that we're talking about vast groups of people. There's no one Black or one Asian person, but really going there, right? And really talking about Black racism, really talking about white supremacy, talking about how all of this has it shaped and informed our lives. And then as I've shared, as an African American who was raised Muslim in this country, like I feel like I have a right, if you will, and I'm not saying no one else does, to embrace and interpret various forms of religion, because the religion, I don't even know what the religions were that my ancestors from Africa practiced. And so everything that we're doing here, even Christianity, we all know, like, it's all, we're mixing and matching. I think there's something very beautiful about that. And so I used to, I think, kind of cower, particularly in my former tradition, where it was just like, this is the pure, pristine, and nothing can be altered, or, which was not even true, but that was what was sold to me. Or I don't want to say sold, that is throwing shade. That was what was presented and taught. But that there is an openness, and that I can embrace all of it, and that I don't think that anyone has a right to say, well, that's not real, you're not doing it real, or, right. And I also, and particularly when there are undercurrents of white supremacy, coming either directly from white folks or also from non-Black people. All right.
Wow. This is another one of those great questions that's complex and brings up a lot of complexity, and obviously a lot of responses. And one of the things I want to go back to when I think about this question is what Lama was talking about in terms, I'm just going to start, this community is starting with justice. That's where we're going to start. And so with this question, I'm wondering, if we start with justice, would this project, if you will, be a waste of time? It feels like nothing that I personally would want to invest my time in. If this community, this particular, just happens to be Asian community, has this belief and has this project, do I want to spend my time working to convince them that their project should be something else? I only have 24 hours in the day. 8 of those hours are sleeping, right? And so the rest of the time is not, for me, it's not about this. But I wish people well. I also respect that people want their culture respected. Now, the question is, who's responsible for doing that work? And can we support each other in having that respect?
Can I add like a little piece here too? Like my root teacher, primary teacher, was an elder Tibetan master, Northern Rinpoche, and after I finished my training, as a Lama, to become a Lama, we go through this, at least I went through a very traditional process where after you finish training, you sit down with the teacher and the teacher tells you what the path is, like what you're doing next, where you're gonna go, right? I call that kind of an authorization, like this is what you're authorized to do. And in my session with him, he just looked at me, he was like, you're Black. It's like there are people who will listen to you and won't listen to me. Like that's your path, right? And he was like, embrace it. Like don't run away from how you're showing up in the world. Use it to help people. Use Blackness, use queerness. And I would go back to him over and over again and say, you know what, I'm talking about queerness, I'm talking about sex and my teachings, I'm talking about all this stuff. He was like, whatever, I can't talk about that. He was doing a lot of it, which made the relationship complicated at the end, when it was revealed that he was engaged in multiple sexual misconduct relationships, and that was the complexity, as we all been pointing out, like this is not simple, We're Black and queer and non-binary and femme and cis. Like we're like there's a complication here that takes time to like really sort out. And then when you're put into different contexts, like when you become a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, there's a whole nother context here that I've taken years to try to figure out, and I ended up back here in my Black dope gay shirt, right? Being surrounded by Beyonce and the Golden Girls, And this is where I ended up. And this is my most authentic and freest expression to date, and it's real complex in terms of how I got here, So, I mean, that's it. With queerness, I just think there's a messiness, like it's not so clear. And there's the transness of queerness is really uncomfortable, right? And when people get really uncomfortable with that, they revert to violence, which is what we're seeing now. It's blurred. And so I can't hold that discomfort, but as someone in this body, in this location, my primary emotional labor has been to hold the discomfort of losing the capacity to name and categorize everything that's happening in this moment for me, and just to be present to what's showing up and arising, right? And that will change you.
Io, you had a question that you wanted to offer? Then this will be our last question.
Oh,
Omar,
okay.
there's no one. It's not. No one's getting cut off. You're the last one.
Okay, good. So this is I guess you could say an experiment, thought experiment, practice experiment, right intention, right speech, quare. Okay. Some of you may know of the artist formerly known as Kanye, who goes by Ye. And my question has to do with some of the things he's been tweeting as of late. Aishah, earlier you said hurt people. Wise words. Words spoken by Kanye, Ye, after he interrupted the award ceremony where Taylor Swift got the award, and he argued that Beyonce should have gotten it. Right? Fast forward. The person who has spoken wise words is speaking words of harm. His anti-Semitism is not surprising to me. His lashing out, his wearing a white Lives Matter shirt, and with that comes a context of interpretation about what that means and what that stands for. That, in addition to saying that George Floyd died of a fentanyl overdose, makes me wonder, what is the appropriate response? Do we throw shade? Do we go beyond that? Do we just stop listening? Should I have not brought it up? But as a Black queer Buddhist practitioner who cares about the well-being of others and preventing, to the extent that we cannot harm, no harm, preventing harm, holding the ethical obligation of non-harm, ahimsa. What is the response? Or is it wise to just not respond?
And I also just want to say that he stalked his wife too, and the whole, just want to bring, so because that's just also all part of it.
Yeah, and then let me just say this: it's not just him. This is part of our culture. How do we respond?
Right, exactly. He's just the most visible in this moment, but it's there. Whew.
I think this is, I don't know. I don't know. But what your question made me think about was the various, I mean, I think a lot about his misogynoir. I think about his antipathy for Black women, including, and how other Black men latch onto that, including holding his dead mother accountable for his behavior somehow, including him talking dirty, grimy about his mom, you know? So I think a lot about Kanye West's antipathy for Black women, and how that didn't raise the alarm for a lot of people. And so then that makes me think of what can I do for Black women? What do Black women, how can I support Black women in particular? And, you know, and then, you know, Black femmes who aren't women as well. So I'm thinking about the impact of his harm, and the communities that feel, you know, it's really interesting, feel torn. And there's another guy, a rapper that I really like, who was like on the sort of conscious side, if people don't know, Toby, you know, and then watching him talk about his disabled wife, Black wife, in this way that was so disgusting, and all she's done to support him, and you know, her like famous facts, and how grossed out he is by her being disabled. And so I think about like what Black women carry with the kind of violence that Black women also are expected to show up for and support, right? So, you know, I had a thought about Kanye that I'll share yesterday, was I thought, I wish someone would just take him out. That was my thought. I was like, I feel like I think he, you know, he needs a restart button. And it was a real thought, you know. I don't mean necessarily that someone should kill him, but that, you know, it's just like he's capable of doing a lot of damage because of his platform. Various platforms, literally buying a platform, buying Parler. And so, you know, there is, going back to what Lama was saying, there is, at least in my tradition, and you know, I'm also not a, you know, Harriet Tubman, I always remind people, was a healer, but also carried a shotgun. You know, so it was like herbs, a light, a lamp, and a shotgun. And so that to me is those are tools, the tools for healing, but also the tools for defense and or you know, violence is a language as well. And I don't, you know, I think as Shante paradigm smalls, what I would say is like, Kanye is dangerous, you know, but he's also a symptom of a larger danger that's quieter, you know, that's more powerful, that's insidious. And because our new gods, or if you've ever watched American Gods, you know, our new gods are the media. And it just amplifies his message. And I don't know what the response is. I think it's an important question, set of questions that you asked. I really appreciate it. So that's what I'll say.
I also I want to jump in and say that just I think echoing the one part that you shared, Shante, around that there are these more insidious and dangerous kind of that are permeating. It reminds me, I think I talk a lot about sexual violence and thinking about the harm to, like the prominent ones, and I'll just name a few, you know, Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, R. Kelly, and the energy can be on all of them, right? But what gets missed are all of the people that allowed this harm to go on. Like as far as I'm concerned, the reason why we all know now is that they no longer had value that they once had, because survivors had been speaking out about these harms from each of these men for a long time. And so we can focus on so-and-so's in jail, or his term, the conviction was overturned, or he died by suicide. We can focus on that, and people can be like, way, yay, or oh wow, like that one person, but we're not thinking about all of the people involved that allow this to go on. So it's like, as I always say, are we interested in pruning the forest, i.e. clipping a leaf here, are we really trying to dig up the roots of violence? I mean, no, those instances I'm talking about sexual violence, but all forms of violence. So I do think that there's something that definitely needs to happen with Ye. I would like to see some kind of call in kind of intervention, but it's not just Ye. And if we put all of our energy there, and I'm not saying you were saying this, Io, that then, and just kind of like, we got to get him under control, or get Candace Owens under control, like that we're not dealing with a larger systems in place, that it is so much bigger. And in some ways, he's a dangerous and powerful distraction, but it's so much bigger. And I don't want us to miss the forest for the trees.
And I'll just add to that, we can't keep ignoring, someone like Conway just does, Ye doesn't just go away. Not someone with that much privilege and power and money, wealth, right? But what Aishah was just sharing, this is like systematic and cultural. Like Ye is just like one example of many examples of how culture validates and supports violence, against women in multiple ways. But with Ye, of course, there's multiple violences. There's anti-Semitism, it's misogynoir, as well. And so, yeah, it's important, I think, that we do what we can on our platforms to call this behavior out, knowing that the bigger work is actually disrupting the roots of why this violence continues. And in many ways, it's celebrated, because Ye is just being, he's just being a man, he's just, and then we equate wealth with value, so if he's rich, then he must be a good person, he's, and that's capitalism right there. So you have this intersection of multiple systems coming together, and a lot of people do not have what's the word? They don't have the span, they don't have the capacity to do this intense and deep work of unraveling all of this. And this is why our work is so heavy, because we're taking on the cultural labor that so many people aren't. And then as Black women and femmes and non-binary and queer folks, that weight is even heavier, right? And I think this is why Harriet Tubman is so important, because Harriet Tubman, I believe, chose that this life and this body as a slave woman, right? Because she knew in this body, she could have the capacity to free, and to do this labor of abolition. Is it right? Is it fair? I don't know. That's another question, but I do know that's the work that we choose to take on if we're actually interested in liberation, and again, I've been so active with cis men, in terms of undoing patriarchy work for years, but I'm interested in the men who aren't interested in the work now. How do I get to them? And will I see it in my lifetime? I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to see the change that I want to see in my lifetime, but it doesn't mean we stop doing the work. So anyway, I'll just offer that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I think this is where we incorporate speculative fiction, right? Envisioning and working towards that which doesn't exist. I mean, we are the products of somebody's imagination and vision right now. I wonder, and so while we work in these moments. So I know that we're at time, and Jennifer, if you want to come back, I see there there's one question. I don't know where we are. I'll just read it out loud. Is how do we protect our communities from trolls that utilize white supremacist, misogynistic opportunism? Yes, vitriol will be used to justify actual violence against our people. How does Buddhism frame liberation in this context? By Jamara Amani. That's their question, which I feel like we're all kind of which is what we've been trying to grapple with.
If I may,
Yes.
I do believe it is right speech to say when someone is wrong. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Right.
You know, and like Rod, I'm not pacifist either. I believe in using the languages inform, you know, compassionate wrath is a real practice.
Harriet said, be free or die. I mean, you know, compassionate wrath. She was, so, yeah. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Io. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just want to ask a clarifying question for people who might be wondering, because I might be wondering a little bit as well. Are you saying that if someone doesn't want the kind of freedom that you want, and you're leading a freedom movement, then that person needs to be hampered in some way, you know? And I'm wondering if those who are able, Dr. Shante, to get into the spirit and mind of Harriet, for someone to know who Harriet was, to know that there was an attempt to be free, and someone changes their mind and wants to go back for whatever the reason, that puts the whole group of people in peril. And she's got a choice to make. It's either you or us. You want to go back and then get us enslaved and killed? I don't think so. So I'm guessing that's part of it, because I wanted to put that in so people don't leave thinking that all of us think that if you don't follow my way towards liberation, then you just need to die.
Right. And she didn't kill anybody. Actually, that's the other, I mean, that was what she said, but it's not like these were, and as a result, there was a massive, Harriet committed murder on the trail.
It's also that's the last of the four karmas, right? Is that extinguishing, right? So it's first, I would, you know, pacifying goes a long way, right? And then the kind of enriching the environment, and sometimes they call the third form of reconciliation or magnetizing people to you. And then the kind of the last thing that tool you can use in that set of tools is destroying. And destroying doesn't mean just killing. It actually may be, as Aishah said, cutting out the roots of violence. But a lot of the violence, at least in my experience, that is happening, I would say 75% of it can be done with just turning down the volume of a lot of the stuff. So that you never go to, okay, I'm gonna put you in a headlock and punch you out. That's not the first thing. But I want to say that it is an option. It is a tool, and it is a tool that has to be wielded skillfully, and usually sparingly.
And I would just say too, there's a difference between not being interested in liberation compared to not being interested in liberation and then getting in the way of people's liberation. And that's where we have to talk about, how do you get removed out the way like that? And that's when we talk about real liberation struggle, because real liberation struggle gets real messy. You know, it gets real complex when you have to, as Mother Harriet, you know, it was like, you know, if you go back, you're not going to make it back alive. You know, because that was the situation. And not a lot of us, we have to train to get into these higher levels of liberation work that call into question what we think is right and wrong. You know, and if you think you're ready for liberation, I would question that, and I would just step back and really do some work. Like, there are dilemmas that we will face in liberation work, you know. And the Buddha, you know, if you look at past lives of the Buddha demonstrated that he made choices, right, to kill people in order to save the lives of larger groups of people, you know. So there's you know, there's textual, you know, support in Buddhism to back this up. You know.
Yeah, and people don't talk about that part much. They just create, which I think is the kind of the whitewashing, all pun intended, of how it's been presented, but they don't talk about that. We could go on. Go ahead, Jen.
Wow. So thank you so much for this extraordinary conversation. Thank you, Aishah Shahidah Simmons, for moderating. Thank you, Lama Owens. Thank you, Professor Shante Paradigm Smalls. Thank you, Professor Io Yetunde. Thank you. Thank you for this incredible panel and for the ways that you all have reflected on the theme and beyond. I'm grateful. And I just want to call your attention to the announcements that I've posted in the chat. The next iteration of this conversation is on November 17th at 3 p.m. And you can click the link for more information about the series and to register for the next of the events. Also, Black Studies is launching here at Queens, and so we have some in-person events tomorrow and Saturday, and so we invite you to be a part of those. There's some links that will help you to get involved, and if you are joining us from afar, we've got an awesome podcast, and I've provided a link for that in the chat as well. Also look forward to this work developing in the future. It is our hope to publish this conversation and to host a fuller conference through which we'll engage in an interreligious expansion of this conversation at Queens. And so with that said, I think one of the gifts of our time together is not only invoking ancestors like Mother Harriet Tubman and Andre Leon Talley and Audre Lorde, but also we have had an opportunity to remember when we have forgotten. And we also remember that even quare was a way of E. Patrick Johnson remembering the way his grandmother spoke the word queer with a U.S. Southern dialect. And so in this moment, I just want to remind us to be together in imagining new ways forward. And as we prepare for what's to come, allow me please to close with an acknowledgement that calls us to continue the struggle of our nows and futures, and to acknowledge that many of us who have joined this conversation from the land we call Canada are on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississauga, and so many others. And we acknowledge the genocidal violence enacted upon these peoples and other of our ancestors of African and Indigenous descent. So for our own sakes, and as we honor so many ancestors and trailblazers, named and unnamed, we must govern ourselves accordingly. And so I thank you so much, and I invite you to just be a part of the conversation as it goes forward. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all. Peace.